extravaganza. My name's Lloyd De Beer, if you don't know me already, and I'm the honorary director of the BAA. I'm standing in tonight for Julian Luxford, the president, who unfortunately couldn't be with us. So before I begin, you all know this really already, but before I begin, I'd like to ask if you can all check that your microphone is muted. And if it's not muted, please could you do so now? I'd also like to just say a really big thank you to Meg Bernstein, without whom we would be completely lost in terms of setting up these Zoom lectures. So a big thank you to you, Meg. And before we started, I also wanted to draw your attention to the next meeting, to December's meeting on the 2nd of December, which will be by Catherine Turley, and it will be on the famous Angel Choir at Lincoln Cathedral. Tonight's lecture, however, will be, we will be hearing from Anna Eavis. Anna will be known to many of you in the BAA. She's been a long-standing, long-time friend of the BAA. She has the enviable position of being the curatorial director of English Heritage. And what that means is that she has overall responsibility for the presentation and the interpretation of all EH sites, which hopefully we can all get back to as soon as this next stage of the lockdown's over. Anna's been involved for many years with the Corpus Vitriorum of Great Britain, and she's done so much to raise the profile and publicize the study of medieval stained glass. There will be time after Anna's lecture for some questions, so hold on to your questions as they come, and then type them into the chat box. And what I'll do is I'll read them out to Anna, and we can get a response that way. But that's enough for me, and I'll hand over to Anna. But just to say that her title tonight is The Medieval Stained Glass at Holy Trinity, Long Melford. So thank you very much, Anna.
That's better. Thank you very much, Lloyd. I'm just going to try and share my screen with you. Come on. Okay. So is that okay? Can everybody see my screen?
Looks great.
Okay. Before I start, I just want to say thank you for inviting me. I'm sorry we're not all meeting at Burlington House, but it's probably more comfortable where you are and where I am. I'd like to thank, before I begin, well, lots of people have helped me with my thinking about Long Melford over the years, and I have been thinking about it for quite a long time, but I'd particularly like to thank Christopher Parkinson, who is photographer to the Corpus Vitriorum, and he's taken many of the photographs I'll show, including the two you can see now. And he's a wonderful photographer and very generous person, and I'm hugely grateful to him for enabling me to use these. The Church of Holy Trinity, Long Melford in Suffolk is well known to many of you, I'm sure, and it was rebuilt during the second half of the 15th century. Famously, many individuals, ranging from innkeepers and merchants to knights and barons, contributed to this undertaking. It was a flexible form of patronage, allowing people to give according to their means, status, and the scale of their social or spiritual ambition. Some gave a single arch, a stained glass panel, or an altar cloth, while others paid for several architectural bays, or in the merchant Richard Martin's case, a substantial chantry chapel. The evidence for their contributions is to be found in inscribed and flushwork inscriptions on the exterior walls of the church itself, in antiquarian accounts, and in a number of wills. But the whole project appears to have been skillfully coordinated by John Clockton, a member of the local gentry, whose imprint on the church far exceeded that of all other contributors, as we shall see. Clockton himself paid for large chunks of the building work, including the North Nave Arcade and chapels, and with others, parts of the South Aisle, the porch, and the Lady Chapel. It was also Clockton's prolific and effective activity as an executor to many local people that helped secure funding for the church rebuilding. He ensured that their bequests supported the building works and dispersed them, in the words of a contemporary, according to his decision. That is, he made sure that priority elements of the construction were funded in a timely way. There is also evidence that in addition to his expert administration of testamentary bequests, Clockton was able to secure contributions to the fabric and fitting out of the church from the living. And it's really this that I'd like to focus on this evening, with particular reference to the surviving medieval stained glass with which he is so closely associated. John Clockton was born in around 1423, the son of Sir William Clockton and his second wife, Marjorie Frances. When his father died in 1446, John inherited the manor of Kentwell, which was where the family home was, just to the north of the town of Long Melford. And I'm showing here a drawing taken from David Diamond and Clive Payne's excellent book on Long Melford. We can see the church in the middle. At the top of the drawing to the north is Kentwell Hall, which is was the house where Clockton lived. And to the lower right is Melford Hall, where the Martin family lived. And both families were involved in rebuilding the church. And both houses, as you can see, are north of the main settlement as it is now. And Clockton was to be based in Long Melford until he died at the age of 74 in 1497. As a young man, Clockton, like many other sons of the medieval gentry, trained as a lawyer at the Inns of Court, where he was a member of the Inner Temple. He seemed destined for great things and was Sheriff of Suffolk and Norfolk before he was 30 years old. In 1462, however, just after the accession of Edward IV, Clockton was one of 6 East Anglian men to be arrested for treason on a charge of corresponding with Margaret of Anjou. Of these 6 men, Clockton was the only one not to be executed. The reasons for his release are not clear, but are likely to have been to do with his influential social connections. Within 4 years, he was firmly back in the bosom of the establishment. He was a Suffolk Justice of the Peace almost continually from 1466 until his death in 1497, and a member of many royal commissions throughout his long life. His legal training equipped him to act as an attorney, executor, and fefee, activities which, along with his activities as a JP and commission member, brought him into contact with many rich and influential people, particularly through the 1470s and 80s, those connected to Edward IV, like John Lord Howard, John Lord Dinham, and Thomas Montgomery, as well as the elite judges William Hussey and Richard Pigott, both of whom enjoyed close connections with Richard, Duke of York, and with William, Lord Hastings. Through associations of kinship and commerce, Clockton also established connections with those active in London's trade and government, as we'll see. All of these networks are relevant to our study of the glass at Long Melford and to the rebuilding and fitting out of the church. They also tell us more about the sort of man John Clockton was and reveal something about his social and political aspirations, as well as his spiritual preoccupations. Like many East Anglian churches, Holy Trinity was substantially enlarged during the 15th century. And to get our bearings, I just want to do a quick canter through the building chronology, which is informed by the end dates established by documentary and inscription evidence. So work appears to have been in progress by 1467, and surviving wills from this date onwards show how active John Clockton was in driving the building programme forward. It continued through the 1470s, extending the chancel and the nave, extending the church eastwards and heightening it considerably. The chancel was complete by 1479, and the nave with its new clerestory by 1481. There followed the completion of 2 family chapels on the south side to the Martin family, who I mentioned earlier, and to the north side, the Clockton family chapel, as distinct from the Clockton chantry, which we'll come to in a minute. These chapels were completed seems to be by 1484. The aisles were complete by 1487. John Clockton's chantry and the porch to the church were complete by 1494, possibly earlier, and his remarkable Lady Chapel was completed by 1497 when he died. And just for completeness, the choir vestry was completed in 1507. Christopher Wilson has shown how the great urban church of St Peter Mancroft, Norwich, remodelled between 1430 and 55, established a new aesthetic for East Anglian parish church architecture. At Mancroft, the lofty main arcade, topped by a band of clerestory windows, extends unbroken along its east-west axis, unifying the chancel and nave. The same spatial unity was achieved here at Long Melford, evidence of close working by John Clockton with the rector and abbot of Bury St Edmunds, who held the advowson and technically therefore had responsibility for the chancel. Particular prominence was given to Holy Trinity's windows, which, as numerous and as large as possible, effectively form walls of glass. The widened north and south aisles at Long Melford contain, uniquely in Suffolk, paired windows in each bay. And I'm looking here at the left-hand image, which is based on a drawing by Birkin Howard. That's Long Melford. And this image is also important because it shows us another distinguishing feature about the main arcade at Long Melford, caused by the retention, a decision which must have been taken at the outset of the rebuilding, of the 14th century nave piers. So the decision was taken not to replace them, but just to work with them. And you can see that in that elevation. So the resulting proportions of the Long Melford elevation may not quite fulfill the lofty perpendicular aesthetic as modelled on the right at Burwell, but it does allow for an unusually large clerestory window. So those clerestory windows are large and relatively low. They have a low sill. So the sight lines are good from the ground, which is relevant for what we're going to be looking at in a minute.
Anna, sorry to interrupt you just quickly, but every so often when you turn your head to look at your notes, the sound slightly drops out.
Oh, okay.
So I don't know if you might keep your notes in front of you. Just
yeah,
sorry.
Apologies.
No problem at all. Sorry for interrupting.
No, that's fine. Okay. So the splendour of Holy Trinity's late medieval interior is exceptionally well documented, with lists of its furnishings, plate, and vestments compiled in 1529, 1541, and 1547, and churchwardens' accounts for the second half of the 16th century. A remarkable description of the church before the Reformation also survives, written by Roger Martin before his death in 1580. These documents describe gilded tabernacles, textiles, precious plate, sculpture, and altarpieces, vividly evoking the appearance of the church on the eve of the Reformation. And I'm showing you here a remnant of that, a slide which shows the painted decoration that still survives in John Clockton's chantry chapel. It's worth mentioning, I think, that in 1830, when there was a general kind of refurb of the church, traces of painted figures were uncovered on the nave piers too, and painted vine borders to every window. The remodelled church was much longer, higher and lighter than its predecessor, and its most visually dominant element, despite all those fittings, must have been its glazing. Vast quantities of its medieval glass have been lost since the 15th century. Little is known about the original glazing of the aisles or the east and west windows, but antiquarian accounts do enable partial reconstruction of the clerestory scheme. Nathaniel Bisbee's description, written in 1688, is the most extensive early survey, but other useful visual sources include a 1637 account by Henry Lilly, part of his Howard genealogy, and a series of 19th century watercolours made by Hamlet Watling and now held in the Suffolk Record Office. The glazing of the South Clerestory was funded primarily, though not exclusively, by local people who were named at the base of the panels they had paid for. Their subjects included figures of the Trinity and of various saints, including the Apostles, the Virgin Mary, episodes from the life of St. John the Baptist, and a presentation of the Pietà. But none of this glass appears to survive. And I just want to mention here that Richard Marks has done some very important work, which will be published on the relationship between testamentary bequests and windows, and he's done some really useful work on Melford as part of that. So very little of that survives, if anything. What does survive is only a tiny but very highly significant proportion of the original glazing, and it's largely from the north clerestory, and that's what I'm going to concentrate on. Now, between 1828 and 1862, the churchwarden Richard Olmack reset what he considered to be the best pieces of medieval glass. He gathered them from the church, mostly from the north clerestory, and he reset them in the east and west windows of the church. And he painted and refired some of the glass at that time. He also recreated some inscriptions and re-leaded some panels. And here we see watercolours of these arrangements painted by Hamlet Watling. Between 1957 and 1978, King and Sons of Norwich restored the glass and reset it in the windows of the north aisle, where it remains today. So I'm showing you a view from the West End. You can see the glass where it is today in the north aisle windows, but originally it would have been up in the north clerestory in those now empty windows. The clerestory windows each have 6 main lights, 3 above and 3 below the transom. And I'm not going to be talking about the tracery lights this evening. So we're just looking at those main lights. We know from antiquarian accounts that the choir clerestory windows were filled with images of standing saints, of which a few survive, with tiny praying figures, possibly donors of those windows at their feet. And here are some that do survive from the north side. And I just want to draw your attention actually on the left-hand side to that figure, quite a famous figure of St. Edmund, with the abbot of Bury St. Edmunds at his feet. And this was originally part of a window which also contained images of St. Oswald and St. Edward. And under those figures were 2 images of mitred abbots, of which one remains now, mitred abbots of Bury St. Edmunds, appropriate, of course, for that location in the choir. And here's another one on the left, also in the choir clerestory, was this figure, another figure of a Pietà, with the diminutive figure of Giles Dent, who was rector at Long Melford from 1474 to 84, shown below in blue on the left-hand side. And that period when he was rector, that decade, was a critical one in the church's rebuilding, and Dent is known to have worked with Clockton on the building of the nave, on funding that, and after his death, Clockton, as supervisor of Dent's will, ensured that Dent's estate funded the construction and glazing of the westernmost bay of the south aisle. So a really important figure in the building of the church. The glazing of the north nave clerestory was rather different. So we've got these fairly straightforward conventional figures in the choir of standing saints or seated saints with little donor figures below, but in the nave north clerestory we have something different, and I've got an example of one of the figures on the right, Lady Dinham, who we'll come to later. But John Clockton, who had paid for the building of the north nave arcade, also seems to have taken responsibility for its glazing, even if, as I believe, he didn't pay for every panel himself. And his scheme, as you can see here, was dominated by secular figures, each one filling one of those lights. So for each window, 6 big figures. And it's useful to compare these 2 images so that you can see how dominant the Clockton's secular figures are. To get our bearings then, Clockton's scheme extended across the 14 windows of the nave north clerestory. It's likely that every light, 6 per window, so 84 in all, contained a single figure. And with the exception of 3 archangels in the easternmost window, the remaining 81 figures were relations and associates of John Clockton. Only 29 of those figures survive, but thanks to the long-standing antiquarian interest in them, stimulated, presumably by their rich heraldic content, it's possible to identify around 64 of the original figures in Clockton's scheme. Now, because there are so many, and I'm sure you'll be relieved to know I'm not going to go through every single one, I wanted to find a way really of giving you a sense of how the overall scheme worked. And this very simple diagram shows that along the lower register, so below the transom, those orange, mainly orange rectangles represent Clockton's own family. So the lower register was devoted to Clockton's ancestors, his siblings, his daughters, and they were all on the lower register. We don't know who was in the two white windows that I've shown here. It's a tantalising possibility that this central window was filled with a figure of John Clockton himself, but there's no evidence for this, and no glazed figure of John Clockton survives. But that empty window is at a pivotal point between Clockton's forebears, the west and left, and his successors to the east and to the right. And then above the upper register, above the transom, those lights contain groupings of his associates rather than his blood relations, although some were related to him by marriage. And then here's another diagram. This is the dead or alive diagram. It's indicative rather than completely certain, but it shows in blue windows or panels containing figures known to be dead when the glazing was undertaken, and in red, figures thought to have been alive when their windows were made, indicated by inscriptions asking for prayers for their good estate rather than for their souls. And in simple terms, most of the figures in the lower register, Clockton's ancestors, siblings and children, were dead by the early 1480s when these windows were put in, but the upper register is a different story. So the lower register, this is his blood relations mostly, looked a bit like this. So at least 6 windows, that's to the left of that empty one I showed you, contained images of Clockton's forebears, and they included his direct ancestors, his parents, his grandparents, his great-grandparents, as shown here. So on the left, we have Elizabeth Clockton, one of his great-grandmothers, and then the male figure was his grandfather, Thomas Clockton, and on the right-hand side, we have Catherine Clockton, née Mild. Interestingly, however, the scheme also seemed to have included some less direct family connections. His grandmother, Catherine Mild, went on to marry William Tendring after her first husband, Thomas Clockton, died, and their daughter, Alice Tendring, married Sir John Howard, grandfather of the John Howard who by 1483 was Duke of Norfolk. And as we shall see, that John Howard was a benefactor of Long Melford Church. And Alice Tendring appeared with her husband, Sir John, in one of Clockton's ancestor windows along the bottom register. And as we'll see, she also appeared in the Clockton family chapel too. We'll come back to that, it's an important point. That's the ancestors. Moving eastwards or to the right of that empty window, figures included his son, William, John Clockton's son, William, and his first wife, Joan. They don't remain. And next came Clockton's dead sister, Elizabeth, with her 2 husbands, who are shown here. Elizabeth's gone, but her husband on the left, the London draper and former mayor, John Gedny, and on the right, the Sergeant-at-Law Robert Cavendish, both shown here in their civic and professional regalia. And much has been written about John Gedny, in particular, a wealthy London draper who was a leading member of his livery, instrumental in the building of a new Drapers' Hall, an MP, twice Mayor of London, and so on. Gedny, who died in 1449, was buried in the newly built Lady Chapel in the parish church of St Christopher le Stocks in the heart of the city. John Clockton was one of Gedney's executors and was charged with setting up a chantry for him. Gedney's will doesn't survive, but it's possible that his panel at Long Melford may have been funded on Clockton's instruction from Gedney's estate. Both figures are good examples of Clockton's connections with those who were commercially and politically active in London. We'll see a bit more of that. And then next to the right, a sequence of windows. These panels are all from 3 different windows running eastwards, commemorating 2 more of Clockton's sisters, Alice Harleston, her husband and son, Catherine Denston, whose husband John is shown here on the left, and finally his daughters and their husbands. In the centre, we have a figure of Thomas Rookwood, who's now thought, because of the way that the figure was restored by Dennis King, to be John Clockton. It's not John Clockton. Dennis added a bit of Clockton heraldry, but it's actually Thomas Rookwood. And then on the right-hand side, Dorothy Curzon, another of Clockton's daughters. So far then, so straightforward. The lower register of windows were devoted to prayers for the souls of Clockton's own family, the majority of whom were dead by the 1480s when the windows were glazed and when Clockton was in his 60s. So this is expensive but essentially conventional commemorative provision, and it provides us with a rationale for the whole building project, amplifying the inscription on the church porch, which we saw earlier, which reads as follows: "Pray for the souls of William Clockton, Marjorie and Marjorie his wives, and for the soul of Alice Clockton, and for John Clockton, and for all the souls that the said John is bound to pray for." And it's worth noting in this context, and no surprise, that the 1480s also saw the completion of the Clockton family chapel, also known as the Kentwell Aisle, at the east end of the North Aisle. We saw this earlier on the plan, and here memorials to Clockton's family were arranged around the tomb of his father, William Clockton, shown here. And those memorials included 2 windows, which contained heraldry and images of Clockton's parents, grandparents, sisters, and in-laws, and, as already noted, another image of Alice Tendring and her Howard husband, and of their grandson, John, Lord Howard. More of him later. And there were also here brasses of his father's wives, Margaret Drury on the left, and Margaret Francis, that was John's own mother, shown here in the middle, and of his 3 sisters. And 2 had died in 1420. The other, as we've already seen, was Alice Harleston, and she, like her father William, died in 1446. Her brass is on the right here. Her brass and the brass of Clockton's mother date, like the windows, from the 1480s. So they're part of Clockton's creation, effectively, of a new family mausoleum, separate from, but leading to, his own chantry chapel, which was just next door. So a quick look at that with the horrible red chairs. But that's a very extraordinary space, which I'm not going to talk about anymore. But it's just to show you that progression through the church of Clockton's commemorative endeavour. Right, we're going to whip through the upper story now and back to my little chart. So we've seen how the lower register worked, and I think in the absence of any testamentary evidence, it's reasonable to assume that Clockton paid for most of those windows, certainly the ones to his ancestors. It's possible for the funding for the windows to his sisters came from their husband's estates, and perhaps John Howard funded the windows of Alice Tendring. But anyway, we're going to now move up onto the top register of the clerestory and a quick look back at the alive or dead chart. Now, we know that the clerestory was built by 1481, and other evidence taken from the windows and the antiquarian record suggests that the majority of the glazing of the clerestory and that top register of the clerestory was completed around 1482 to 3. And we can see that a high proportion in those upper windows of people who figure in the windows were living when the glazing went in. We know this because the bidding inscriptions refer to their good estate rather than to their souls. And we can also see that in some windows, however, there are included figures of one or more dead persons, which is suggestive when it comes to thinking about how the glass was paid for. So each section, each window contained section 3 lights, enough for a person with 2 spouses, or a spouse and a child, or 3 sisters, or 3 judges, as we'll see. There are a number of different configurations. Now, a few of the clerestory windows featured John Clockton's in-laws, including the 4 sisters of his wife, Alice. I just want to say a little bit about them. What we're looking at here are Hamlet Watling's watercolours of the figures of Eleanor and Margaret, both sisters of Alice, so sisters-in-law of John Clockton, and both dead by the 1480s when the window was glazed. Missing from the window is the figure of Anne Montgomery, another of Alice's sisters, and I think it's likely that she paid for this window. It was made during her lifetime with an inscription inviting prayers for her good estate and for the souls of her sisters. Now, John Clockton had married Alice Darcy, who was the daughter of Robert Darcy of Malden, a lawyer, one of the wealthiest esquires in Essex, an MP, counsel to the Dukes of York and Clarence, steward of the Duke of Bedford, and, like his son-in-law, a member of numerous royal commissions. So a really important, influential figure, and one whom I'm sure was very useful to John Clockton. Anne Montgomery, Darcy's daughter, who's missing from this image, was the widow of John Montgomery, one of Clockton's alleged co-conspirators in 1462. She did not marry again, and she remained close to Clockton. In fact, she was one of his executors. She also seemed to feature in the Clockton family chapel windows in the North Aisle. And it's worth noting that Anne herself was not buried in East Anglia, but in the nuns' choir of the Minaresses in London. And it's perhaps because of Anne's links to the convent that John Clockton himself left money to the Minaresses in his will. Here we see a window, most probably commissioned by Elizabeth Barley, who's shown in the middle here, flanked by her 2 husbands, Ralph Jocelyn on the left and Robert Clifford on the right. Elizabeth and Clifford were alive when this window was made, according to the inscription. But Jocelyn had died in 1478. His will has not been traced, so it's not possible to establish whether he left money for a window at Long Melford, but he was buried in St Swithin's Church in London. And his widow, Elizabeth, a kinswoman of Clockton's wife, was his executrix. So it seems reasonable to assume that she, perhaps acting in her capacity as his executor, had the window made. We know that she also commemorated him in a monument with her and Clifford at Asbydden Church in Hertfordshire. So this was one element, if you like, in a commemorative portfolio. And Clockton is likely to have known Jocelyn anyway. Among the City of London's most illustrious drapers and aldermen, Sir Ralph Jocelyn was twice Mayor of London, also enjoyed the patronage of the King. Edward IV's relationship with London merchants was closer than any king had previously enjoyed, and he based his court and government in London and relied on the city for financial and political support, taking care to regularly meet, entertain, and reward its leading merchants and administrators. During the first decade of his reign, he accorded knighthood to 18 London citizens, of whom Jocelyn was one. Only 11 had ever been honoured in this way before. At Long Melford, it's notable that Jocelyn is shown in his alderman's robe and that his inscription refers to his mayoral office, pray for the soul of Ralph Jocelyn, twice Mayor of London. Now we come to the first set of figures without any kinship to Clockton, the widow Agnes Frey and her 2 daughters, Margaret Lenham and Elizabeth Waldegrave. The inscription beneath the figures originally read, "Pray for the soul of Dame Agnes Frey, and specially for Dame Margaret Lenham and for the good state of Elizabeth Waldegrave." Clockton, a close associate of the husbands of all 3 women, was executor to both Agnes Frey and Margaret Lenham, but neither mentions Long Melford in their will. Agnes died in 1478, so before this window was made. In her will, which is replete with London interests, she requested burial in St Bartholomew the Less, in the tomb of her first husband, John Frey. Agnes charged her daughter, Margaret Lenham, with setting up a chantry. And although Margaret obtained a license to do so in February 1482, she was herself dead by September that year, before it could be established. Margaret transferred the responsibility to her own executors, and it was John Clockton who founded the chantry at St. Bartholomew the Less on her behalf. It's not possible to determine exactly when or by whom these panels were commissioned, or whether Margaret was still living when the commission was agreed, as the inscription is ambiguous in her case. But it's possible that Margaret and Elizabeth, advised by John Clockton, paid for the window from Agnes's estate, they having been entrusted in her testament to dispose of the remainder of her goods for the benefit of her soul. It's also possible that as executor both of Agnes and of Margaret, John Clockton commissioned the glass on their behalf. His spiritual obligation to the Lenhams, that's Margaret Lenham and her husband, is striking. The window inscription asks the viewer to pray specially for Margaret, and in Clockton's own testament, she and her husband John feature prominently, named first among those souls for whom Clockton was bound to pray. Clockton's extensive liturgical and devotional provision on their behalf included 1,000 masses at institutions favoured by Margaret Lenham and her husband, such as the Charterhouse and Sion Abbey. This is a familiar image to many of you, I'm sure. Clockton's contact with the legal profession and with the very high end of the legal profession is illustrated in the remarkable survival of these representations of 3 judges, each wearing his legal regalia. All 3 were living when the panels were installed, according to the inscription, which requested prayers for their good state. Their names are John Hoare, Richard Pigott, and William Hussey. Hoare and Pigott are shown in the party-coloured robes and coif of the sergeants at law, and Hussey appears in the robes on the left-hand side of the Chief Justice. John Hoare was involved with some of the wills at Long Melford, which could explain his interest in the glazing of the church and the commissioning of a panel for himself as part of this scheme. He was very much a city lawyer, retained as counsel by the Pewterers and Mercers Company and governor of Lincoln's Inn. Richard Pigott was one of an even more elite group of lawyers, the King's Sergeant at Law. He was a Yorkshireman, owning land in the north of England and acting at various times for the city of York and St Mary's Abbey in York, and as a JP in Yorkshire. He also purchased land in Essex and Hertfordshire and was an assize judge in Norfolk from 1467 until his death. He sat with Clockton on a number of commissions, and he also had London connections. By the 1480s, he owned an expensive residence in the precinct of the Augustinian nunnery of St Mary's, Clerkenwell, and this is where he was buried. Pigott was closely aligned with the House of York. He was a member of the Duke of Gloucester's council and was retained by the Duchy of Lancaster from 1476. The third judge in the window, often identified as William Howard, is, I think, Sir William Hussey, Chief Justice of the King's Bench from 1481 to 95. Hussey had close connections to the royal court. He was retained by the Duke of Gloucester, was counsel to Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, was deputy chief steward in the south parts of the Duchy of Lancaster from 1474 to 81, and with Richard Pigott was appointed executor to the Lord Chamberlain in 1481. It's interesting that Hussey and Pigott were both appointed executors in the will of Lord Hastings, a figure who appears to have been known and even close to many of the people commemorated in Clockton's glazing scheme, although I don't think he was represented himself, but he crops up in quite a lot of the wills and documents relating to people who are shown in Clockton's windows, which takes us up a notch to the loftiest members of Clockton's circle. At least 3 noblemen, John Lord Dinham, Sir Thomas Montgomery, and John Lord Howard, later Duke of Norfolk, were each represented in the upper windows of Clockton's clerestory. Each was shown in a separate window with their wives, and it's also likely that another window featured and was perhaps paid for by Elizabeth, Duchess of Suffolk, Edward IV's sister. Only the figures of Montgomery, shown on the left here, and Dinham's first wife, Elizabeth Fitzwater, in the middle, survive today. The drawing of Howard's figure is by Henry Lilly, dating from 1637. Now, like William Hastings, Dinham, Montgomery, and Howard had all fought with Edward IV at Towton, the decisive battle which saw the young king crowned. Unlike William Hastings, all were rewarded for their contributions, and by the 1480s were enjoying status, power, and wealth. Thomas Montgomery enjoyed a kinship with John Clockton. His brother John had married Anne Darcy, as I mentioned earlier, a sister of Clockton's wife Alice. Montgomery was originally shown with his wife Philippa, with an invitation to pray for their good state, suggesting that the panels were made during Montgomery's lifetime and before Philippa's death in around 1485. So that fits with our 1482 to 3 window. By the early 1480s, when the panel was made, Montgomery was one of Edward IV's most trusted councillors. Having been created a Garter Knight in 1476, he accompanied the king on the French campaign of 1475, receiving, like Lords Hastings and Howard, a substantial annual pension from Louis XI as part of the settlement. He later served as ambassador for Edward and negotiated the ransom of Henry VI's widow, Queen Margaret. He was presumably encouraged to commission the glass by his kinsman, John Clockton. Despite his East Anglian interests, an Essex lad, Montgomery established a strong connection with London, and it's interesting that when he died in 1494, he was buried in the Cistercian Abbey of St Mary Graces, east of Tower Hill, in the Lady Chapel, which he built there. Oh, apologies. I'm just going to go back one. Sorry. John Dinham, now represented here by his wife Elizabeth, was a member of the king's household by 1461 and elevated to the peerage in 1467. He appeared in the windows with his first wife Elizabeth Ratcliffe, heiress of Lord Fitzwalter of Wood and Water in Essex, who's shown here. And they were both alive when the window was made, which must have been before 1485 when Elizabeth died. And at this time, during the early 1480s, Dinham was spending much time in the service of the king overseas. He had commanded Edward IV's fleet during the 1475 French expedition and was, by 1483, Lord Hastings' deputy at Calais. And it was through his first marriage in around 1467 to this Elizabeth that he extended his influence to East Anglia. It's worth noting that at around the time that the Long Melford windows were made in 1482, Montgomery and Dinham, Lord Dinham, co-founded a prayer fraternity at Alting in Essex, which suggests that they had an interest in collaborative forms of commemoration of this. This was another one, and it's perhaps significant that at Long Melford, the Dinhams and the Montgomerys are represented in adjacent windows. Like Dinham and Montgomery, John Howard, shown in this drawing, enjoyed the rewards of Edward IV's patronage too, following his service at the Battle of Towton. And in fact, his was perhaps the most meteoric ascent of the three men. Knighted on the battlefield, he was a member of Edward IV's household from 1468 and appointed a Knight of the Garter in 1472. He was Hastings' deputy at Calais, played a leading role in Edward's French campaign of 1475, and he led the king's fleet in the Scottish campaign of 1481. His power in East Anglia was of military value to Edward, as was his fleet of ships, cargo, and convoy vessels, which could be commandeered for the king's use. In some ways, Howard could be said to embody the combination of commercial and landed interests which characterised Edward IV's court. He had commercial property in Colchester, Harwich, Ipswich, and a residence in Stepney, which gave him ready access to wharves, warehouses, and the City of London, with whose merchant class he had close links. His commercial income probably exceeded the £1,000 generated by his estates, making him much richer than most of his peers. This is Lily's drawing of him, Lord Howard, and his wife, his first wife, Catherine, as they appeared in the clerestory at Long Melford. There was also a figure of his sister Elizabeth, Countess of Oxford. Again, they were alive. John Howard and his wife were alive when the glass was made. He'd not yet been made a duke, which happened in 1483. So it was again in that 1482 window. As the construction of the clerestory was not finished until 1481, this narrows the date range for the manufacture of Howard's glass to 1481 or 2. On his return, I'm just going to move back actually, we're looking at the wrong slide. On his return from Edward IV's Scottish campaign, Howard spent most of 1482 at Tendring Hall, his estate in Suffolk, where he finished building a new chapel. Henry Lilly, in his document, which we're looking at now, described Howard as a good benefactor towards the building and glazing of Long Melford Church in the reign of Edward IV. In this context, it's interesting that Howard's accounts for 1481 to 2 record a number of visits to Melford, payments for the carvers there, and the settling of a debt of £10 with Master Clockton. This is circumstantial evidence, of course, but could indicate Howard's contribution to the Holy Trinity project, made directly to the carvers who may have been working in stone or wood, and indirectly through John Clockton, who may have paid for glazing or building work on Howard's behalf. Although the Howard accounts also include a payment to a London glazier, the glazier by the Friar Austinsgate in 1482, this is more likely to have been for windows installed in his own chapel at Tendring Hall or at the parish church of Stoke by Nayland. As has already been mentioned, his grandparents, Sir John Howard and Alice Tendring, also featured in the clerestory glazing at Long Melford and in Clockton's family chapel in the North Aisle, along with images of Howard's second wife Margaret, his sister Elizabeth, Lady Oxford, and his maternal grandmother Elizabeth Mowbray, wife of John, first Duke of Norfolk. The presence of Alice Tendring may have been important, in fact I'm sure it was important for John Clockton, as it was evidence of his kinship with the Howards. But it must also have been part of a wider commemoration by Howard of his paternal grandparents. And we know that at Stoke by Nayland, Howard had recently completed his grandfather's rebuilding of the parish church there, presumably in order to make it a suitable family mausoleum. He installed glazing of Sir John Howard and his wife, Alice Tendring, there, and the arms of Howard impaling Tendring on the church tower and font. And in his new private chapel at Tendring Hall, another stained glass image of Lord Howard included a shield bearing the arms of Howard quartering Tendring. And I think it's quite interesting that Howard is doing all of this work more or less at the same time as Clockton, with this interest in promoting that ancient lineage. I'd now just like to say something very briefly about the implications of this mixed cast of donors for the fabrication of the glass itself. There's a lot more work to do on this, but I have made a start and it's possible to say some preliminary things. It seems likely that what I could just call the three noble windows, so with the windows to Montgomery, Dinham and Howard, were made in the same workshop, and that this was a different workshop from that producing the other surviving glass. This is apparent, for example, in the painting of the surviving faces of figures from those windows. So here we've got Thomas Montgomery and Elizabeth Fitzwater, and those faces looked at very close up, which is possible to do with Christopher Parkinson's great photos, show some great similarities in terms of the shaping of the face. You can actually even see on this PowerPoint the chins and that sort of round shading of the cheek, and also the ways in which the washes around the eyes and the construction of the eyes too. I think they are certainly by the same painter, contrasted with some of the other female faces. So on the right still we've got Elizabeth Dinham, and the other faces are on the top. This is a face type which is quite common for a lot of those female figures in the upper clerestory. So like the Frey, Lenham, Waldegrave sisters and mother, and this is Lady Hungerford. And then the figure below with that rather sort of long ski slopey nose and very ingenious ear. Again, that face type crops up quite a lot on the lower register. So on figures who feature in John Clockton's kind of genealogical sequence. And I think we can say some similar things about the figure design. So here we can see that Thomas Montgomery and John Howard have a similar posture, that with the hands pressed together and elbows apart, and that this is different from the way in which most of the other men are represented. Just using an example here to show the difference between that posture and this sort of open-armed posture, which is much more common among the other male figures in this scheme. And similarly, if we look, for example, at the way, and I'm thinking now about cartooning really, but the way in which the gown and cloak of these female figures, even though we're comparing a drawing, 17th century drawing on the one hand with a surviving window on the other, I think it's possible to see that, broadly speaking, those garments are conceived of in the same way. Whereas here on the right is Lady Dinham in the red, and compared with this rather ungainly form of one of the Clockton ancestors. And this partly disrupted by the damage it suffered, but I hope you can see there that this is a rather odd arrangement of the hands, which were originally made out of one piece of glass, so it doesn't really quite work visually, but it's commonly used in the figures on the lower register. And then again, another contrast between Lady Dinham's outfit and then this image on the left, which shows again a much more common form for the gown and the mantle, which, and it's possible to see maybe 6 or 7 figures using that cartoon. So I think what that tells us, and as I say, it's something that I need to do a lot more work on, is that it's suggestive, I think, that it's certainly the case that there are different designs in play and different painters in play, but it's suggestive that these seem to relate to groups of donors and to groups of figures. And I think that in the case of Howard, Montgomery and Dinham, it's not an accident that those 3 seem to have been made by the same workshop. And an interesting question is whether that was handled completely separately by one of them, by Howard, say, or whether it was handled on their behalf by Clockton. Discuss. Okay, we're nearly done. And just some concluding remarks, really. So when viewed from the town's entrance at the south side of the church, Clockton's windows must have had a phenomenal visual impact. The sight lines were excellent, and the figures of his friends and family were prominent, emblazoned in the vivid colours of their official regalia or heraldic arms. And while the donor figures in other windows were small and knelt, often in groups, in humble supplication at the feet of intercessory saints, those in Clockton's scheme each filled a single light, leaving little room for any religious imagery. The scheme, even in its fragmentary state, is a unique survival, but what is less clear is whether it was unusual for its time. Although series of similar figures undoubtedly existed in the 15th century, for example at St Mary's, Warwick, it's not possible to know how large they were and whether they filled the entire windows or were kneeling before religious imagery. Clerestory glazing had long been used for heraldic display, although more commonly this simply involved shields of arms rather than figures. The nave of York Minster, for example, was glazed with shields of the northern nobility in the early 14th century. And at Tewkesbury Abbey, 2 14th century clerestory windows contain full-length figures of 8 men who succeeded to the honour of Gloucester. The clerestory windows of the parish church at East Harling in Norfolk, glazed in the early 1480s, recorded the 14th and 15th century alliances of the Wingfield family. And this was displayed in a chronological series of impaled shields with kneeling figures of Sir Robert Wingfield and his wife Anne Harling. And this is a figure here from East Harling. So that's quite an interesting parallel, I think, although not identical. Instructions for the glazing of the Observant Friars Church at Greenwich in the 1490s, early 1490s, included detailed specifications for a series of royal figures arrayed in the correct arms, which suggests that this wasn't an unknown phenomenon. Here's another slightly later and much starrier parallel in the royal window sequence made to commemorate the Dukes of Burgundy for the Chapel of the Holy Blood in Bruges. And my point here really is more about a vogue for these monumental, here really very large, secular figures. John Clockton's glazing scheme most resembles, of course, a great heraldic role, adopting established conventions of representing men and women dressed in their arms. The very careful representation of the lawyers and aldermen has parallels in tomb sculptures and brasses, but perhaps also owes something to the developing culture of visual representation in legal and civic institutions. And I'm thinking here about that wonderful series of pen and ink drawings of the London aldermen, commissioned in 1446-7 by themselves, of themselves. And the format of those drawings was almost certainly based on those produced in around 1430 by William Bruges, of members of the Order of the Garter. And the alderman series represented each alderman in his official regalia. And the windows of the halls and chapels of the Inns of Court were filled with the heraldry, inscriptions, and perhaps depictions of living lawyers. A judge, perhaps William Hussey, is even shown on the opening page for plea roll in 1481. It's striking, and I've written about this elsewhere, that many of the people commemorated, especially those still living in 1482, had London interests or associations. Margaret Lenham and her mother, Anne Montgomery, Dame Anne Hungerford, the lawyers, William Hussey, Richard Pigott and John Hoare, aldermen and drapers, Ralph Jocelyn and John Gedny, and the noblemen, Howard, Dinham and Montgomery. Dinham and Montgomery both buried in London. Some were active in the city as aldermen or lawyers. Several were buried in London or its suburbs, owned or rented property in the city, and left testamentary bequests to London's religious institutions, especially the mendicant and Carthusian houses, and to the city's anchorites, lepers, and prisoners. John Clockton's glazing scheme at Holy Trinity Church, Long Melford, as well as commemorating and making provision for the souls of himself, his family and friends, made manifest an association with a living, influential group of people engaged in the government of the realm through the royal household, the judiciary and many civic institutions. There were, of course, local interests too. Howard, Montgomery, Dinham, Waldegrave, Lenham and Darcy were all East Anglians, in Dinham's case by marriage, if not by birth, while Pigott and Hussey officiated at the Norfolk Assizes and acted for the Paston family. These men worked together in many contractual configurations as witnesses, fethies and executors. But their social mobility and influence, and that of their wives and daughters, were fueled by their connections with London, because of its growing economic and political power, and with the Crown. Given all of this, it seems perhaps odd that John Clockton, in the midst of this great social circle, was never knighted. It seems that on the 5th of June, 1483, he received notification sent on behalf of the young king-in-waiting, Edward V, by the advice of our dearest uncle, the Duke of Gloucester, and of the Lords of our Council, charging him to prepare and furnish yourself to receive the noble order of knighthood at our coronation, which by God's grace we intend shall be solemnized the 22nd day of this present month at our Palace of Westminster. In the event, of course, that coronation never took place, and for some reason, the call never came again. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna. That was really, really wonderful. You know, I think you just really brought to life this building as an index of the past, current, and future greatness of this series of interlinked families. I mean, I was thinking a lot while you were talking about how important family is at Long Melford. I was thinking about Roger Martin's account and how he talks about the fact that he has this sculpture of a crucifix in his house that was from Jesus Isle or something, and how he hopes that someone in his family will restore it at some point back to the church in the future. You know, so I was really enjoying that and thinking about it from all kinds of different angles, which I'm sure many others were too. So if anyone has any questions that they'd like to ask, I've seen a few have been coming into the chat bar already. Please do take a moment to fill them in there. I will go through and have a look at what's already in there. There's a question from Helen Hughes, who asks, are the clothes worn by women believed to be actual costumes or representative of their status, relationships, heraldry, etc.?
I think they're not, I don't think they're actual garments, although I don't know actually whether the design in terms of the, you know, I think the form, so you will have seen some of them had little fur collars and the trimmings and so on, may well derive from actual costume, but I think the really important thing about them is the heraldic display. Having said that though, Helen, I have been getting quite interested in the headdresses, which I think are, you know, so the headdresses I think are thought to be a good reflection of what was worn, and I think it's a really rich subject which I haven't explored myself yet. But there's a lot of detail you can see in some of the faces. You can see the veil, that, you know, the way those elaborate headdresses were kind of pinned. You can see the pins. You can see that there's layers of veiling. So, I mean, as you can tell, I'm not an expert on medieval costume, but I think there's a lot in those figures that probably is deriving from what was actually worn. But the most important thing about them is the heraldic display and what that tells us.
We have another question from David Fogden. There was apparently no representation of Lady Clockton, Alice. Any ideas? Might she have been in that central space?
Yeah, I think if the central space did contain, I mean, it sort of makes sense, doesn't it, that that's where they'd be. I mean, clearly they were also, though, in the Chantry Chapel. So so I suppose it would make sense for them to be in the North Clerestory, and yes, I think if he was there, she would have been there. But don't forget, I suppose, that they had that Chantry Chapel, so it's a progression up the nave, you know, through the family chapel into that little Chantry Chapel where she was represented. I mean, I don't know if there's a window in there as well, but certainly she was represented, obviously, in that monument.
If as Anne is answering, if you feel like you wanted to reply to that, do reply in the chat box. So Stephen Hughes asks, beside the obvious expense of such a large number of windows, are these windows thought to be relatively cheap or expensive? Is the reuse of cartoons here more of a reflection of expense or on the attitude to portraiture in general?
I think it was probably really quite expensive, Stephen, because it's very colourful, and coloured glass was more expensive than white glass. And the other thing about it was that because in many cases they were carefully replicating heraldic detail, so they had to get that right. You know, so that figure I showed you of Lady Dinham towards the end, you know, she had that kind of wonderful red mantle and gown. You know, all of those details of the heraldic markings have to be got right. So the cutting is really important. So my sense is that it actually was probably quite expensive because of the raw materials and because of the cutting involved. The reuse of cartoons, I mean, yes, it is economical to do that. There is also something, I think, about the rhythm of the kind of visual look, that it would have been wonderful to see the whole thing up. I mean, all of those sort of serried ranks of women, looking very similar, actually has quite a lot of power about it too.
Charlotte Dubose asks, does the different stances in the men that are kneeling, legs in versus legs out, signify anything other than just a different artist?
I'm not sure about that. I mean, and I need to do some more work on it. There are some other poses as well, and I think they're probably, my feeling is that the source for the posture probably most likely relates to conventions in commemorative brasses, I suspect. So I think there's something there. My feeling is that it's likely to be to do with the workshop that produced it, but so I actually do feel that there is a difference between those, the Montgomery and Dinham figures and let's say the figures of Clifford or Crane, and I suppose what we don't really know though is to what extent the workshop is saying, well, no, this is how we do it. or to what extent the patron is actually taking a view on how he or she wants the figure to be portrayed. But it's a really interesting question. I'm not sure.
Timez has said, that was really wonderful. Anna, thank you. Do we know anything about the South Clerestory that faced all these figures? It's a very good question.
Thanks, Tim. Yeah, so quite a lot is known about what was in it. So there's early Nathaniel Bisbee account from the 17th century does list a lot of those windows, and but I don't think any of it survives, although I haven't actually done a proper riffle through all of the scraps that are at the church. But they're mainly, I think they're almost all standing figures. I think they're from memory. There was perhaps episodes in the life of John the Baptist, I think. But it does look as if, you have these colossal figures on the north side, as I say, kind of pow, 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 but on the south side, it's much more conventional. So it would have been standing saints. So probably looking a bit like those images I showed you of St Edmund and the Pietà, that kind of thing, is my impression from the antiquarian account.
Nigel Clubb has asked, do we know to what extent secular schemes, I guess on such a scale as this, appear in the naves, aisles of churches rather than in chantry chapels?
Hello, Nigel. I can't see you, but it's nice to know you're there. Well, I don't know. Yeah, I think that's probably a huge question, actually. But as I said, I think there is a lot of evidence for the use of nave clerestory glazing for this kind of scheme, by which I mean, heraldic schemes at least. And there are quite a lot of good examples, particularly from the mid to late 15th century in the Midlands, and again, Richard Marks has looked at this a lot when he did his PhD all those years ago. And I suppose what interests me at Long Melford is that the scheme is distinct from Clockton's Chantry Chapel and from a family chapel. That you've got these different elements, I suppose, all working together.
A question from Leonie Seliger. Do you have an opinion on why the secular figures seem to have been installed on the north side rather than the south side?
Hi, Leonie. I did mean to mention you, Leonie, as somebody who had helped me. Leonie has been working on the conservation of the glass and has given me lots of helpful ideas, and hope will continue to talk to me about this question about workshops and different painters and things like that. I think they're on the north side for two reasons. One is that he paid for the building of the North Arcade. So, there was an inscription now lost on the north side of the church saying that Clockton had paid for that, the completion of the north nave side. I suppose the other reason is that that's the side that is, the north side, of course, is the nearest to his house. And so, traditionally, I suppose all of his stuff, I guess, is on the north side, which has proximity to his dwelling. And the other thing, there is also an impact visually from when you enter the church. I think that's got to be significant. You go through the south door and bam, there it is. I think that's I don't think that's an accident. It wouldn't have such an impact if it was on the south side, I think.
If Leonie doesn't have enough beautiful glass at Canterbury, gets to work on glass at Long Melford too.
The glass at Long Melford really needs her.
Okay, I think we'll take one more question and then we'll wrap up. So this one last question from Stephen Hughes. Did Clockton have any close relatives similar to those who were portrayed in the North Clerestory, who were alive at the time of the glazing, who were not included in the scheme? Oh, that sounds quite mean.
Oh, probably. I'm sure he did, but I'm afraid I don't have to hand a kind of encyclopedic knowledge of all of his relations. But probably there are. I mean, there are bound to be people missing. I suppose that. I think what I find, one of the very many things I find tantalising also, however, is that there are a couple of windows you will have seen in my little schematic diagrams, for which we really don't know who was in those. And there is, as I said, this suggestion that that Elizabeth, Duchess of Suffolk, was in one, but there are still some gaps. So I don't know is the very short answer. I'm sure there were.
Okay, thank you so much, Anna. And thank you all for joining us tonight. I will hope that wherever you are, you will join me in kind of raising a little clap to Anna for that brilliant paper. And hopefully we will see you all again on the 2nd of December. So take care in lockdown. Don't watch too much news at the moment and stay well. And see you all in December. Bye-bye.